"Don't look at her like that." The words cut through the hall, quiet but sharp enough to make every wolf turn. At the far end of the palace chamber, beneath the hanging silver banners and the cold light of the moon spilling through the high windows, the young woman stood with her shoulders drawn in and her hands trembling at her sides. Dust clung to the hem of her plain dress. She looked too small for a room built to impress the powerful, too fragile for the stairs pressing down on her like stone. Her name was Alara, and everyone in the pack knew she was the Omega nobody had ever bothered to protect. Tonight, she had been summoned to the winter gathering, where noble families came dressed in velvet and gold, where bloodlines were weighed like coins, where a single wrong breath could turn a person into a joke. She had not come to be noticed. She had come because refusing the summons would have brought consequences to the only cottage she still called home. So she stood there, chin lowered, listening to the low murmur of voices around her. One of the council wives gave a soft laugh. Another let her eyes sweep over Alara's faded sleeves and scuffed boots with open disdain. "She must have gotten lost on the way to the servants' hall," someone whispered. A few wolves smiled. Alara's cheeks burned, but she kept still. She had learned that moving too quickly only made them crueler. The air smelled of pine resin, candle wax, and expensive perfume, but beneath it all she caught something else, something warm, something steady, like the quiet center of a storm. It made her heart stutter. At the head of the chamber, seated beneath the black iron crest of the throne, the Alpha King had not spoken yet. He sat with one elbow resting on the arm of his chair, dark eyes fixed on the room, as if he were reading every hidden thread in it. His presence changed the air. Even the loudest nobles seemed to lower their voices when they realized he was watching. King Kale was known across the northern territories as a ruler who never wasted words and never tolerated disrespect in his court. His name alone could silence a room. Still, no one expected him to care about an Omega like Alara. That was why the laughter came so easily. "If she's here to serve wine, someone should tell her where to stand," a man near the hearth said, and a few others chuckled. Alara swallowed the pain in her throat and took a careful breath. She turned toward the table where a crystal pitcher waited, but before she could move, a noblewoman stepped into her path and let her shoulder brush against Alara's arm with deliberate insult. The pitcher tilted. Red wine flashed in the candlelight and spilled across Alara's dress, staining the pale fabric a dark, ugly color. The chamber went silent for one hard second, and then the room broke into laughter. Alara froze. She could feel the warmth of the wine soaking through her clothes, the sting of humiliation spreading faster than the stain. Her fingers curled, then loosened. She would not cry here. Not in front of them. Not again. "Oh dear," the noblewoman said, far too pleased with herself. "How clumsy." Alara lifted her eyes just enough to see the smirk on the woman's mouth, and something inside her held steady instead of breaking. She stepped back once, slowly, keeping her breathing even, keeping her pride where they could not touch it. Across the hall, the Alpha King's gaze sharpened. He saw everything. The stain, the smirks, the way Alara's hands shook even while she refused to bow her head. And when he rose from the throne, the entire chamber seemed to draw in one startled breath. Alara did not move when the laughter swelled again. She stood in the middle of the chamber, wine cooling on her sleeves, her chin lifted just enough to keep her dignity from slipping in front of the watching court. Around her, silk rustled and jewels flashed beneath the torchlight, but no one reached for her. No one ever did when the room wanted a spectacle. The noblewoman who had spilled the wine leaned back in satisfaction, already certain this humiliation would become another story the court would repeat over and over. Alara felt every stare like a pinprick against her skin, yet she kept her hands folded loosely at her sides, because trembling was the one thing they wanted to see. She would not give them that satisfaction. At the high table, the Alpha King had risen fully now, one hand resting on the carved arm of his throne, his gaze fixed on her with a stillness that made the air feel tight. He did not speak at first. He only watched the way Alara steadied her breathing, the way she refused to bow, the way the room seemed ready to swallow her whole if no one stopped it. Then, without warning, he descended the steps of the dais. The laughter thinned at once. Conversations faltered. Even the servants stopped moving. Every eye followed him as he crossed the chamber with measured, unhurried steps, his presence cutting through the mockery like a blade of cold moonlight. Alara felt his approach before she dared to look up. His shadow reached her first, long and quiet, falling over the stain on her dress and the hands she had clenched so tightly at her sides. She expected another cruel word from the nobles. Another sigh. Another look of pity that would feel worse than laughter. Instead, the Alpha King stopped beside her and took in the scene with one sweep of his eyes. The noblewoman's smile faded. The men at the surrounding tables went still. The king's voice, when it came, was low and calm, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. Who thought this was amusing? No one answered. Alara could feel the silence gathering around her like a cloak. It was the first time all night that the room had not felt like it belonged to her humiliation. Slowly, almost carefully, the Alpha King turned his head toward the woman who had thrown the wine. The woman's face paled. She tried to lift her chin, but the effort looked brittle. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice suddenly thin. He cut her off with a look. Nothing sharp, nothing loud, just a look that made her words collapse before they could form. Then he took one more step closer to Alara, and when he spoke again, the chamber heard every syllable. "This court bows to strength," he said, "but only fools mistake cruelty for it." A hush moved through the hall. Alara felt the heat rise behind her eyes, not from tears, but from the strange, painful weight of being seen. Truly seen. Her throat tightened as he looked down at the stain on her dress, then back to her face, as if the spilled wine mattered less than the fact that she had been left standing there alone. His expression did not soften, but something in it shifted all the same. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "You will not stand there another moment," he said quietly, and before Alara could understand the meaning of his words, he removed his own dark cloak and placed it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body, heavy enough to settle over the trembling in her hands. It hid the stain. It hid the smirks. It hid, for one sacred instant, the part of her the court had tried to turn into a joke. The room forgot how to breathe. Alara stared at the edge of the cloak, then slowly raised her eyes to his face. There was no mockery there, no pity either, only a deliberate, unshaken attention that made her pulse stutter. And in that impossible silence, the Alpha King said, "No one here will speak to you like that again." The silence that followed felt almost holy. Alara could still feel the weight of his cloak settling over her shoulders, still feel the warmth of it sinking through the thin fabric of her ruined dress. And for the first time that night, she did not feel entirely exposed. The Alpha King stood close enough that she could see the steady rise of his breathing, the calm line of his jaw, the way his gaze remained fixed on the court as though he expected every soul in the chamber to remember their manners by force of will alone. Around them, nobles shifted uneasily. No one laughed now. No one smiled. Even the ones who had moments ago looked at Alara as if she were something to be stepped over were suddenly busy studying the floor, their faces pale with the uncomfortable knowledge that they had gone too far. Alara swallowed hard. She had been told too many times in her life to stay small, to stay quiet, to be grateful for scraps and kindness offered with one hand while the other held a knife of judgment. Yet the cloak on her shoulders told a different story. It said she was seen. It said she mattered. It said the shame they had tried to pin to her skin did not belong there anymore. "Your Majesty," one of the older lords began, his voice careful now, almost trembling with forced respect. There was no intended offense. The Alpha King did not turn toward him. He kept looking at Alara, and somehow that made the room feel smaller. "Intent," he said evenly, "is not the only measure of cruelty." The Lord fell silent. Alara felt the words like a quiet breath against her bruised pride. Not loud, not theatrical, just true. And truth, she was learning, could be more frightening than anger. She lifted one hand and caught the edge of the cloak at her collarbone, holding it there as if it might slip away if she was not careful. She had never been the sort of woman people defended. She had been the sort they explained away. But this strange, still moment in the heart of a merciless hall, felt like the beginning of something she did not yet know how to name. The Alpha King finally looked down at her, and when he did, the hardness in the room did not soften, but something in his expression deepened, as though he had come to a conclusion he was not yet ready to speak aloud. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. The question stunned her more than the cloak had. It was not command, not pity, not performance for the watching court. It was simply concern, direct and unadorned. Alara nodded once, though her knees still felt unsteady beneath her. Yes, she whispered. Good. His answer was almost a murmur. He extended his hand, not forcing it, merely offering it. The gesture was so measured, so deliberate, that for a heartbeat she could only stare. The entire hall seemed to lean toward the space between them. Then, slowly, with the kind of caution reserved for fragile things, Alara placed her hand in his. The contact was brief, but it sent a strange shiver through her, not fear exactly, and not comfort either, but something that existed between recognition and relief. He closed his fingers gently around hers, then turned, leading her away from the center of the chamber, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a king to escort a woman the court had just tried to break. The nobles parted without being asked. Their heads lowered. Their voices disappeared. Alara walked beside him, feeling every step as though the floor itself had changed beneath her. At the far end of the hall, near the tall windows where moonlight spilled in silver streaks over the stone, he stopped and released her hand at once, as if he understood the danger of holding on too long in a place that watched everything. You should not have been left alone there, he said. Alara looked up, stunned by the simplicity of it. No one had ever spoken to her, as if her loneliness had been an injustice. Not like that. Not as something that deserved correction. She drew a careful breath, the kind that hurt a little going in. I am used to it, she admitted before she could stop herself. The words came out softer than she intended, and she hated them the moment they left her mouth. They sounded too practiced, too familiar, like a wound she had carried for so long she no longer remembered how to hide it. Something in the Alpha King's eyes changed at once. Not softness, not yet, but attention sharpened into something almost painful. Then you have been mistreated for too long, he said. The certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. Alara did not know what to do with a man who spoke like that, as if the world had been mistaken and he had the right to name the mistake aloud. Before she could answer, a faint sound drew his gaze past her shoulder. The court had gone still again, but not from fear this time. From anticipation. A servant had entered at the edge of the hall, bowing so low that his hands trembled. In them was a sealed envelope, black wax stamped with a crest Alara did not recognize. The servant offered it with obvious hesitation, and the moment the Alpha King saw it, every line in his body seemed to sharpen. He took the letter without breaking eye contact with the seal, and for the first time since she had met him, Alara saw something flicker across his face that did not belong to the courtroom at all. Not anger, not surprise, something deeper, older. He broke the wax, unfolded the page, and read only the first line before his hand stilled. Alara could not see the words, but she saw the change in his eyes, the immediate, controlled stillness of a man who had just learned something that mattered very much. When he looked back at her, the moonlight behind him turning the edges of his dark silhouette to silver, his voice was lower than before. Alara, he said, and hearing her name in his mouth felt like standing at the edge of a door that had just begun to open. Who told you that you were unclaimed? Alara's breath caught at the weight of his question, because the courtroom around them seemed to fall away the moment he spoke her name. The polished stone, the waiting nobles, the tall windows washed in moonlight, all of it faded into a silence so complete that she could hear the soft rustle of her own sleeve when her fingers tightened around the edge of it. No one had ever asked her that before. Not like that. Not with patience. Not with the quiet gravity of a man who seemed to understand that the answer could change everything. Her throat moved, but the first sound did not come. She had spent so long learning how to make herself small that being seen this clearly felt almost dangerous. The Alpha King watched her with a stillness that was not cold, only controlled, as if he had already decided that whatever she carried in silence mattered. Alara lowered her gaze for one fragile second, then lifted it again. No one, she said at last, and the words were so soft they almost vanished into the air. No one ever told me anything. I was simply left to guess. Something in his expression tightened, though he did not interrupt. He only waited, as if he had all the time in the world and her truth was worth every second of it. Alara swallowed, and with each breath the memory she had tried to bury rose again, sharp and humiliating. The village hall, the quiet laughter, the look of pity that had followed her for years like a shadow. She had not planned to speak of it. She had only come to the court because the summons had said her name, because the seal on the page had carried enough authority to make refusal impossible. But now that she stood before him, with his attention fixed on her, as though she were not a mistake or a burden, but a mystery he intended to understand, the old shame began to loosen its grip. "I was told many things," she said carefully, each word measured as if it had to survive being spoken aloud. "That I was forgettable, that I had no place in noble halls, that if there was a destiny for someone like me, it would be to remain unnoticed until the end of my life." The sentence hung between them, fragile and ugly in its honesty. Several of the court attendants shifted uncomfortably, but the Alpha King did not look away. In fact, he seemed to listen with increasing stillness, his jaw set not in anger, but in something far more dangerous to the lies that had shaped her life. Alara looked down at the sealed letter he still held, then back to his face. "I believe them," she admitted, and the confession cost her more than she wanted to show. It was easier than hoping for more. For a moment, the only sound was the distant crackle of torch flames and the faint hum of the night beyond the windows. Then the Alpha King folded the letter once, carefully, and his gaze remained on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Who told you?" he asked again, softer now. "That you were unclaimed?" The word struck deeper the second time. Unclaimed. Not unwanted. Not unworthy. Unclaimed. Alara's heart gave a small, startled thud, as if some hidden part of her had recognized the difference before her mind could. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she saw the seal on the letter glint in his hand, saw the way his thumb rested over the wax as if the message inside had already changed the course of his decision. He knew something now. She could feel it in the air between them, in the way the room had sharpened around his silence. And when he finally stepped closer, the movement slow and deliberate, the moonlight traced a pale line across his cheek and caught in the silver at his throat, making him seem both distant and impossibly near. "Alara," he said once more, and this time her name sounded less like a question and more like the beginning of a vow. "I want the truth." She inhaled, steadying herself against the strange and fragile hope rising in her chest. Because for the first time, the truth no longer sounded like a punishment. It sounded like a door. And somewhere beyond that door, waiting in the hush between one breath and the next, was the life she had never been allowed to imagine. Alara held his gaze, though her pulse kept stumbling against the silence he had asked for. The room was still, yet nothing about it felt calm now. Every candle flame seemed to lean toward him. Every shadow seemed to wait for what he would do next. He stood there without moving, his attention fixed on her as if the answer he wanted was not simply a piece of information, but something far more dangerous: trust. "The truth," she repeated softly, almost as if tasting the word for the first time. It felt foreign in her mouth. It felt like hope. For so long, she had learned to keep the truth small, hidden, and quiet, because the world had never been kind to what it did not understand. But there was something in his face now that made her wonder if maybe he was not asking in order to judge her. Maybe he was asking because he was already tired of guessing. She looked down at the wax resting beneath his thumb, the sealed message no one else had touched, and a strange ache tightened in her chest. He had not opened it. He had not broken the seal. He had simply held it as though it mattered. As though she mattered. That small mercy nearly undid her. Outside, the wind brushed the windows with a soft, restless sound, and the moonlight shifted across the floor in thin white bands. Alara drew a slow breath and felt the weight of every choice she had ever made press gently against her ribs. Some truths, once spoken, could not be called back. Some truths would change the shape of a room, a name, a life. She knew that now, yet standing before him, with his silver eyes waiting and his voice lowered to something almost tender, she no longer felt like a girl being cornered. She felt like someone at the edge of a threshold, suspended between fear and freedom. His shoulders eased a fraction, as if he had noticed the change in her silence. "You can tell me," he said. "Not an order, not a demand, just permission." The words slipped into her like warmth. She swallowed, then lifted her head again. "If I speak," she said carefully, "you may not like what you hear." A faint expression crossed his face then, brief as lightning behind clouds. He did not look away. "Try me," he answered. The quiet between them deepened. Alara wished she could tell whether it was courage or foolishness that made her step closer. Perhaps it was both. She moved until only a few feet remained between them, close enough to see the faint strain at the edge of his restraint, close enough to notice how still he had become, as if he feared one sudden motion might shatter what little trust had formed between them. She had expected power to feel loud. Instead, it felt controlled, waiting, listening, and somehow that was more unsettling than any roar. That message was not meant for the council, she said at last, each word measured, careful, honest enough to cost her something. It was meant for you. The air changed. Not dramatically, not with thunder or spectacle, but with the quiet force of a door opening in a house no one had entered for years. He looked down at the wax again, then back at her, and something in his expression sharpened with understanding. Who sent it? He asked. Alara hesitated. Names had consequences. Names built bridges or burned them. She thought of the hidden chamber, of the old signet rings, of the fear she had seen in the servant's eyes when the message was delivered. She thought of the way her hands had trembled when she realized the seal belonged to a line long believed to be extinct. Her voice came out softer this time. Someone who knows your past. He went perfectly still. The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. It was the kind of silence that carried memory in it. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the brief flicker behind his eyes, in the controlled inhale that followed, as if he had just stepped on a ground he had not meant to revisit. Then he lowered the parchment at last, and folded it once with careful fingers. And you, he said, what do you know? It was not accusation. It was fear, hidden beneath restraint. Alara felt that fear answer inside her own chest. She had spent years learning how to survive by saying less than she knew, by making herself small enough to pass unnoticed. But now, with his question waiting in the hush between them, she understood that silence would no longer protect her. It would only delay the moment when everything changed. She lifted her chin. Enough to know I was never meant to find this alone. His gaze held hers, unblinking, searching. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. And then, from somewhere beyond the chamber doors, came the distant sound of approaching footsteps, measured and unhurried, drawing nearer through the corridor like fate itself refusing to be delayed. The footsteps stopped just beyond the chamber doors, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the torches on the walls. Alara did not move. She could feel the warmth of the parchment still in his hand, could see the tension gathered in the set of his shoulders, as if he were bracing for a truth he had already begun to fear. Then the doors opened. A guard stepped in first, head lowered, and behind him came an older man in a dark traveling cloak, his silver-streaked hair neatly tied back, his expression calm in the way that made calm itself seem suspicious. He took in the room with one slow glance. The parchment, the open ledger, Alara standing by the table with her chin lifted despite the strain in her face. Your Majesty, the guard said softly. The messenger has arrived from the eastern road. The older man gave a slight nod, but his eyes never left Alara. I know who she is, he said, and the words settled through the chamber like a dropped stone. Alara felt her breath catch, not because of the certainty in his voice, but because of the way the man beside her went still, as though every muscle in him had tightened at once. That should not be possible, he said under his breath, and there was something raw in it now, something far less controlled than before. The newcomer removed one glove with deliberate care. On the back of his hand, faint beneath the lamplight, was a mark that Alara had seen only in old records and whispered warnings, the crest of a line meant to have disappeared generations ago. The room seemed to tilt. Alara's pulse thudded once, hard and cold. The stranger noticed her staring, and, for the first time, his composure softened. You recognize it, he said. She did not answer at once. Her mouth had gone dry. Beside her, the man who had been reading the parchment let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. There was recognition. There was dread. Then the stories were not stories, he said. They hid the bloodline in plain sight. The older man did not deny it. He stepped farther into the chamber, and the air seemed to sharpen around him, carrying the faint scent of rain and pine from the road outside. I came because the seal was broken, he said, and because the girl should never have been left to piece this together alone. Alara felt the weight of that sentence settle over her more deeply than any accusation could have. Alone. All those years of being made to feel like a shadow had not been accident. They had been design. She looked from one man to the other, trying to understand why her heart was racing so fast it almost hurt. "What seal?" she asked. The older man's gaze held hers with surprising gentleness. "The one that kept your name hidden," he said, "and the one that is weakening now." The chamber seemed suddenly too small for the truth inside it. The man beside her turned toward the window, as if he needed the cold glass and the night beyond it to steady himself. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "If that is true," he said, "then everything we believed about the succession, the treaty, the oath." He stopped, and Alara heard the fracture in that silence more clearly than any shouted confession. The older man answered before the fear could spread further. "Then it all changes." He looked at Alara again, and this time his expression carried something almost like relief. "And she is no longer the one standing outside the story." Alara did not speak at once. The words still hung in the chamber, quiet and heavy, as if the night itself had leaned closer to listen. She stood very still, one hand resting against the edge of the table, and tried to understand why the truth felt less like a revelation than a door opening inside her chest. Hidden, weakening, changing everything. The older man had called it as calmly as if he were speaking about weather, yet his face carried the grave patience of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. Beside her, the man near the window remained turned away, his shoulder rigid, his attention fixed on the dark glass. Alara could see only his profile, but she could feel the tension in him, the effort it took to remain composed. It unsettled her more than fear ever could. "How long?" she asked at last, her voice quieter than she intended. The older man took a breath before answering. "Long enough for the council to make decisions based on a truth that was never complete." That made the room feel colder. Alara's fingers tightened against the table. She had spent so long believing that she was invisible in the rooms that mattered, a name spoken only when someone needed a mistake explained. Now every sentence seemed to press against something buried and delicate. The older man looked at her with steady eyes. "You were not kept outside by accident," he said. "You were placed beyond reach because your presence altered what others feared most." Alara swallowed. The sentence should have made sense of everything, but instead it deepened the ache of not knowing where she belonged. The man by the window finally turned. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were not. There was strain there, and something else she had not seen before. Recognition, or perhaps the beginning of it. "If the seal is failing," he said slowly, "then the timing cannot be ignored." The older man gave a small nod. "It cannot be delayed any longer." Alara felt the two of them speaking across a distance she could not cross, using words that carried the weight of histories she had never been allowed to read. She drew a careful breath. "Then tell me plainly," she said. "What am I to them?" The older man did not answer immediately. Even the pause seemed chosen with care. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer than before. "To some, you are a threat. To others, a promise. And to a very few," he said, "you are the last chance this house has to remain whole." The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. It was not empty. It was full, crowded with meaning Alara could almost touch, and still could not name. She looked from one man to the other, searching for a sign that would make the path ahead clearer, but both wore the same restraint, the same careful control of men who had seen too much to speak carelessly. Then the man near the window crossed the room and stopped just a few feet from her. He did not crowd her. He did not reach for her. Yet his presence changed the air. "If what he says is true," he said, "then you will need protection before the council meets again." Alara heard the word and felt something in her shift. Protection. Not pity. Not dismissal. Not another polite way of saying she should stay quiet and grateful. She searched his face, uncertain what to trust in him, and found only the same guarded intensity she had seen when he first looked at her name written in the old ledger. "And if I do not want to be protected?" she asked. A flicker moved through his expression, almost a smile and almost sorrow. "Then you are still entitled to the choice," he said. The answer struck her harder than any command would have. For a moment, she simply stood there, breath caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. The older man lowered his gaze, as though he understood the cost of that hope and respected it. Outside the chamber, the wind pressed softly against the stone. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began to ring, slow and measured, marking the hour as if the castle itself had decided that time could no longer wait. Alara lifted her chin. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt like the only thing inside her. If she had been hidden, then someone had chosen to hide her. If the seal was weakening, then the truth had been waiting all along, patient as a heartbeat. And if the story was changing, then perhaps she was not standing outside it after all. Perhaps she was standing at the edge of the first page that had ever truly belonged to her. The chamber doors closed with a soft, final sound, and for a moment Alara could only listen to the silence they left behind. It was a strange kind of silence, not empty, but full of breath held too long and truths waiting at the edge of speech. The older man still stood near the hearth, his hands folded behind his back, his face unreadable in the low gold light. He had not spoken in the way the others had spoken. He had not looked at her as though she were a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. He had looked at her as if he were trying to remember a promise made long before she was old enough to understand its shape. "You are not the first to carry a seal like this," he said at last, his voice calm and measured, almost gentle. Alara's fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. "Then why does it feel like I am standing at the center of something everyone else already knows?" The man lowered his eyes for a moment, and when he looked back up, there was no kindness that softened the truth, only honesty. Because some truths are hidden not to punish the one who bears them, but to protect them until the world is ready. The words settled over her like snowfall, light and cold and impossible to ignore. She wanted to reject them. She wanted to say that protection did not feel like this, that being hidden had felt too much like being forgotten. But there was something in the old man's expression that stopped her. He was not asking her to be grateful. He was asking her to understand. And that was somehow harder. Outside, the castle wind moved through the stone corridors in a low, restless murmur. Somewhere beyond the walls, boots passed over the floor with slow, careful steps. The castle was awake now. Not in the loud way a feast hall woke, full of voices and clinking cups, but in the quiet, dangerous way of a place that had just realized its own secret had begun to breathe. Alara drew in a steadying breath. The air still carried the faint scent of old cedar and ash from the hearth, but beneath it was something else now, something sharper, something that made the small hairs at the back of her neck rise. Recognition, not from the room, from within herself. It was only a flicker, so brief she might have mistaken it for imagination, but she felt it all the same. A pull. A stirring, as if the seal the man spoke of was not merely a mark on her skin, but a door that had been waiting for the right hand to touch it. "What happens now?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The man did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to the table near the window and picked up a small object wrapped in dark cloth. When he turned back, he held it carefully, as though whatever lay inside was older than the room itself. "Now," he said, "we stop pretending the past has stayed buried." Alara's heart gave a hard, quiet beat. He crossed the chamber and placed the bundle into her hands. It was warmer than it should have been, as if it had been resting near a living flame. She looked down and slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a silver pendant, simple at first glance, but the moment her skin brushed it, warmth spread through her palm in a way that made her inhale sharply. The shape was unmistakable. A crescent. Beneath it, a thin line of engraved markings she could not read, though her eyes seemed to know them before her mind did. "This belonged to your mother," he said. The room tilted. Not physically. Something deeper. A silence so complete it seemed to swallow the air around her. Alara lifted her gaze, and for the first time, the old man looked uncertain, as though he understood that he had just opened a door that could not be closed again. "My mother," she repeated, the words thin as glass. "You knew her?" He nodded once. "Better than most. And if the seal is weakening now, then it is because she left it waiting for you." Alara stared at the pendant, at the soft gleam of silver catching the firelight, and a memory moved at the edge of her mind like a shadow trying to become a face. A voice humming somewhere far away. A hand brushing her hair back from her forehead. A feeling of being held very still, very safely, before everything changed. She did not know if the memory was real or only a fragment made by longing, but her chest ached with it all the same. Why would she hide this from me? The question came out small, and she hated that it did. The old man's expression gentled, but only slightly. "Because there are things in this castle that fear being named. And because if they had known what you were, they would have tried to take it from you before you were ready to keep it." Alara's throat tightened. Not from fear this time. From the terrible, fragile shape of understanding. Her life had not been empty by accident. Her loneliness had not been random. Someone had shaped the silence around her like a wall and called it mercy. Yet even now, standing in the middle of that truth, she did not feel broken by it. She felt awake. The old man's words settled over Alara like a lantern lowered into deep water, and for a long moment, she could only stand there and breathe. The castle around them seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The same cold stone, the same tall windows, the same hush in the corridors beyond the chamber door, yet everything felt sharper, as if the hidden shape of her life had finally been outlined in light. Alara lifted a hand to her chest, fingers pressing lightly against the steady beat there. She had spent so many years thinking emptiness was simply who she was. Now she understood it had been arranged, carefully and deliberately, like curtains drawn across a window. The truth hurt, but it also warmed her in a strange and tender way. It meant she had never been forgotten by fate, only delayed. If they feared what I was, she said quietly, then why let me live as if I were nothing at all? The old man did not answer at once. He looked toward the far window, where the late afternoon light touched the glass in pale gold bands. When he spoke, his voice had the weariness of someone who had carried a secret for far too long. Because some hearts are cruel enough to mistake hiding for kindness. And because the ones who loved you most believed silence was the only shelter they could give. Alara closed her eyes. A memory flickered again, not clear enough to trust, but bright with feeling. A hand smoothing her hair. A voice speaking her name like a blessing. The shape of protection, not as a cage, but as a promise. When she opened her eyes, the ache in her chest had changed. It was still pain, but it was no longer the kind that crushed her. It was the kind that made room for something else. A question, perhaps, or a beginning. The old man drew a slow breath and reached into the fold of his cloak. This time, when he extended his hand, he was holding a small silver key, worn smooth by age. It caught the light and flashed once, soft and certain. There is one door you have not opened yet, he said. If you are ready, it will answer what memory could not. Alara stared at the key. It looked far too ordinary to hold anything sacred, and yet her entire body reacted to it, as if she had been waiting for it all her life. Her fingers trembled when she took it. The metal was cool against her skin, but the touch sent a warmth through her that spread slowly, as if some long-sleeping part of her had just stirred and recognized its name. Where does it lead? She asked. But even as the words left her, she already knew this was not a question for distance or stone or halls. It was a question for herself. The old man gave the faintest nod, as if he had expected that. To the place where your story was set aside, not ended. Alara looked down at the key again, and then toward the dark hallway beyond the chamber, where the air seemed to wait with quiet patience. She thought of the lonely years, the careful lies, the soft grief she had worn so long it had nearly become her shape. Then she thought of the strange, bright ache in her chest, and the way awakening did not feel like thunder. It felt like standing very still before a door and realizing, with a tremor of wonder, that it had been waiting for her all along. She wrapped her hand around the key. Her pulse steadied. Her fear did not vanish, but it lost its power to rule her. The silence around her was no longer empty. It was full of possibility. Alara looked up, and in her eyes there was no more pleading, only resolve. Then show me, she said. The old man bowed his head, not in ceremony, but in reverence, as though he had just witnessed something rare and precious return to the light. And together, in the hush of the old castle, they began to walk toward the door that had been waiting in the dark, toward the truth that had shaped her life, toward the moment when she would finally meet herself. Alara did not move at first. The key felt warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her longer than she had waited for it. The old castle around her seemed to breathe in the dark, every stone holding its silence like a secret. Ahead, the narrow passage opened into a long corridor lined with faded tapestries and silver candle sconces, their empty cups catching what little light remained. The old man walked beside her with a careful, almost reverent pace, as though each step carried them closer to something sacred. "Do you hear it now?" he asked softly. Alara listened. Beneath the hush of dust and age, beneath the faint creak of settling wood, there was another sound. Not loud, Not urgent, just steady, a low pulse, like the memory of a song pressed into the bones of the house. Her breath caught. The feeling in her chest shifted again, no longer a bright ache, but a quiet pull, a thread drawing her forward. She followed it past a row of arched windows where moonlight spilled in pale ribbons across the floor. In that silver wash, her own reflection flickered and vanished, then returned, uncertain and changed. She had spent so long being told that she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Too quiet, too strange, too ordinary, too weak to matter. Yet each step deeper into the castle made those old judgments feel thinner, like paper held too close to flame. At the end of the corridor stood a door taller than the others, carved with twisting vines and a crescent moon worn smooth by centuries of touch. Alara stopped before it, her fingers hovering over the wood. The old man remained a respectful distance behind her. "This is the place," he said. Her throat tightened. She expected fear to rise again, expected her heart to race, expected doubt to return and drag her backward. Instead, she felt only stillness. Deep, strange stillness. The kind that settles over the world just before dawn. "What if I am not ready?" she whispered. The old man's answer came after a pause so gentle, it almost felt like mercy. "You have been ready longer than you know." Alara let that settle inside her. Then, slowly, she placed her palm against the door. A faint warmth answered her touch. Not heat, not warning. Recognition. Her eyes widened as the carved vines beneath her hand seemed to catch the moonlight and shimmer, leaf by leaf, as if waking from a sleep that had lasted generations. The key in her other hand gave a small, bright pulse. Alara drew in a sharp breath. Something in the castle shifted. Not the stone, not the air. Something older. Something that had been waiting for her name, for her touch, for the exact moment she would stop asking whether she belonged and begin to remember that she always had. She looked back once at the old man, and he nodded, his expression unreadable except for one thing, quiet pride. Then Alara turned to the door again. Her hand no longer trembled. She lifted the key, aligned it with the lock, and when the metal met the ancient turn, the silence around her deepened so fully that she could hear her own heartbeat. One breath. Two. Then the lock answered with a soft click. The sound was small, almost fragile, yet it felt like the whole world had shifted with it. Alara closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them again, there was a glow slipping through the seam of the door, thin at first, then steadily brighter, like morning pushing through a sleeping sky. She did not know what waited on the other side. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was not being led by fear. She was being called by truth. And as she pushed the door open, the light reached for her like a welcome home. The glow widened as Alara stepped through, spilling gold across her face and warming the air around her like a living breath. The chamber beyond was not a room at all, but a hidden sanctuary carved into stone older than the kingdom itself. Tall windows of colored glass caught the first light and broke it into ribbons of rose and amber. Vines had grown through the cracks and wrapped the columns in soft green lace, as if time here had been waiting patiently for someone to return. Alara stood still, her fingers curled around the key, her heart beating too hard to speak. Ahead of her, at the center of the sanctuary, lay a circular dais covered in dust and moon-white petals. And on that dais rested a single object beneath a veil of silver fabric. She could not see it clearly, but she felt its pull instantly, quiet and certain, like a memory she had never lived. "Go on," Adrian said behind her, his voice low and careful, as though he understood that whatever waited ahead was not meant to be rushed. Alara swallowed and took one step, then another, the hem of her dress brushing the stone with a whisper. The air grew warmer with each pace, scented with cedar, old parchment, and something sweeter, something that made her chest ache in the strangest way. At the edge of the dais, she stopped, her hand lifted on its own, hovering above the veil. For one brief moment, she thought of every locked door, every closed gate, every time she had been told that some spaces were not made for people like her. Then she heard it again, not a sound this time, but a feeling, deep and steady, as if the sanctuary itself were breathing with her. She drew back the silver cloth. Beneath it was an ancient book bound in white leather, its cover marked with a crest that glimmered when her fingertips brushed it. The instant she touched it, The symbols across the chamber awakened one by one, lighting the walls in a ring of soft blue fire. Alara gasped and stepped back, but the light did not chase her. It followed gently, like recognition. Adrian went still. "Alara," he said, and there was wonder in his voice now, honest and unguarded. She looked from the glowing walls to the book in her hands, and the weight of it settled through her like truth finally finding its place. The pages opened on their own, and the first line waited there in neat, old script, written as though it had been expecting her for years. Alara read it once, then again, unable to breathe for the sudden tenderness of it. She was not a trespasser here. She was not an accident. She was the answer to something ancient. And somewhere beyond the sanctuary, beyond the stone and the silence and the long years of waiting, something that had been asleep began to stir. The line in the book seemed to breathe beneath Alara's fingers, each word arranged with such quiet certainty that her chest tightened. Adrian stood beside her without speaking, his attention moving from her face to the open page and back again, as if he were afraid that one sudden sound might break the moment apart. The chamber remained bathed in that soft blue glow, the symbols on the walls pulsing in a slow rhythm, patient and ancient, like the sanctuary itself had been waiting to exhale. Alara traced the first sentence with her eyes, and as she read, the room changed around her in ways she could not explain. Not in shape, not in stone, but in feeling. The air had warmed. The silence had softened. The strange heaviness that had shadowed the chamber since they entered began to lift, thread by thread, as though her presence had loosened some long-sealed knot. She swallowed and turned the page. Another line appeared, then another, each one revealing itself only when she was ready to understand it. It did not feel like studying. It felt like being recognized. Adrian's voice came low beside her. "Do you understand what it says?" Alara did not answer at once. The words were old, but they were not distant. They spoke of a keeper, of a bloodline hidden in plain sight, of a promise made beneath moonlight and never broken. And at the center of it all was a name that made her breath catch, not because it was unfamiliar, but because some quiet part of her had always known it belonged to her. Her throat tightened. She looked up at Adrian, and for the first time since they stepped into the sanctuary, he seemed uncertain. Not fearful, just deeply aware that the truth unfolding here was larger than either of them. "This place was built for someone," she said softly. Adrian's gaze held hers. "For you," he answered, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The blue fire along the walls brightened at once, and Alara felt a strange shiver move through her, not cold, but something closer to awakening. The page beneath her hand turned again without command, and a new passage appeared. This one spoke of a threshold, of a sealed path, of a chamber that would open only when the one it waited for stood before it with an honest heart. Alara's pulse quickened. Somewhere deep beneath the floor, she heard it then, a low and distant sound, like stone shifting in its sleep. Adrian turned toward the far end of the room, his posture changing in an instant. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Alara nodded, unable to look away from the book. The symbols around them shimmered brighter, and a thin line of light began to trace itself across the floor, moving slowly toward the inner wall. It did not rush. It did not warn. It simply arrived, deliberate and calm, like a path remembering where it was meant to lead. Alara followed it with her eyes, then lifted her hand as if she could feel the pull of it in her own skin. The chamber answered at once. A hidden seam appeared in the stone, so fine she might have missed it if the light had not touched it first. Her breath caught. Adrian stepped closer, careful and silent. Together they watched as the wall began to part, revealing darkness beyond, deep and waiting and unmistakably alive with something ancient. Alara stared into it, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was not afraid, not truly. What waited inside did not feel like danger. It felt like memory. It felt like home calling her by a name she had never spoken aloud. Adrian looked at her then, and his expression changed in a way she would remember forever. The wonder was still there, but now it carried something steadier beneath it, something that felt like trust. "If you want to turn back," he said quietly, "we can." Alara looked into the dark opening, then back to the book cradled against her chest. The answer settled inside her with calm, impossible certainty. She had spent too many years being told where she did not belong. She would not step away now that the truth had finally opened its eyes. "No," she said, and her voice surprised her with its strength. The word echoed softly through the chamber, and the blue fire answered with a brighter pulse. Then, from somewhere beyond the hidden door, came a sound so faint she almost mistook it for a trick of the air. A voice, not quite clear, not quite awake, but unmistakably reaching for her. Alara lifted her head, every breath sharpened by the moment, and the book in her hands grew warm as sunlight. Whatever had been sleeping beyond that wall had heard her, and for the first time in her life, she understood that being chosen did not mean being trapped. It meant being found. Alara did not move at first. The warmth in the book spread through her palms like a living promise, and the faint voice beyond the hidden door seemed to wait with her, patient as a held breath. The chamber around her was still, the blue fire wavering softly inside the crystal lamps, painting the stone in shades of silver and ice. She felt small beneath it all, and yet not powerless. That was the strangest part. For once, the silence did not feel empty. It felt expectant. She tightened her fingers around the book and took one slow step toward the wall. The sound came again, clearer this time. A weak murmur pressed against distance, as if someone on the other side had found the strength to notice her. Alara swallowed. Her heart beat hard, then steadied. "I am here," she whispered, though she was not sure who needed to hear it more, the voice in the dark or the part of herself that had gone unheard for so long. The blue flames answered with a gentle flicker, and the hidden seam in the wall began to glow along its edges. Not all at once. Slowly, as if the stone itself was remembering how to open. Alara leaned closer, her breath catching as thin lines of light ran downward in a perfect arc. The book grew warmer still, and a soft vibration hummed through her hands, as though the pages recognized what the room was becoming. She thought of every place she had been told to leave, every doorway that had closed before her, every moment she had stood outside and convinced herself she belonged there less than anyone else. But this was different. This door had not shut her out. It had waited for her. The seam widened with a quiet sigh, and cool air brushed across her face, carrying with it the scent of stone, dust, and something else she could not name. Old magic, perhaps, or memory. Alara lifted her chin and stepped forward as the opening revealed a narrow passage beyond, dim and silvered, with the faint outline of carved arches deeper inside. Somewhere past the first turn, that voice breathed again. Not loud, not commanding, just enough to stir the air and pull at her attention like a thread tied gently around her soul. She answered without thinking. "Do not be afraid." The words left her lips before she could doubt them, and when they did, the glow in the passage brightened by a shade, as if the darkness itself had heard and softened. Alara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the dizzy shock of being needed, being expected. The book in her hands pulsed once, then settled, calm and warm against her chest. Behind her, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Ahead of her, the passage waited. She took another step, then another, each one quieter than the last. The stone beneath her slippers was cool and smooth, and the blue light followed her like a blessing. The voice came once more, closer now, and with it came a trembling note that made her chest tighten. There was pain in it, yes, but also relief, as if something long hidden had finally sensed the world was no longer shut. Alara touched the wall as she passed, fingertips grazing the ancient carvings etched into the stone. They were worn almost flat with time, but she could still make out shapes of wings, circles, and a crown split by a line of stars. Symbols older than the castle, older than fear. A soft gasp escaped her when the passage opened into a larger chamber beyond. She stopped at the threshold, eyes adjusting slowly to the dim glow within. It was a room unlike any she had seen, circular and vast, with pale roots curling through the ceiling and a pool of silver water at its center. And there, beside the pool, half hidden in shadow and wrapped in a cloak of ash gray, was the shape of a man seated against the stone. His head was bowed. One hand rested weakly against the floor. The other seemed to be reaching toward her, though he had not yet found the strength to lift it fully. Alara could not see his face, only the outline of him, only the stillness. Yet her pulse changed at once, as if some deep part of her had recognized him before her mind could. She stepped inside, the book tightening warmly against her chest, and the man stirred at the sound of her footfall. His head lifted by a fraction, and though his features were still hidden in shadow, Alara felt the weight of his attention settle on her like moonlight. The room seemed to breathe around them. Then he spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion, but unmistakably alive. "You came." It was only 2 words, but they struck her with a force she did not understand. Not surprise, not fear, something deeper, something that made the air between them feel fragile and sacred all at once. Alara stood very still, looking at the shape of him beside the silver pool, at the way the chamber had opened only when she refused to leave, and at the steady warmth now glowing through the book pressed to her heart. Somewhere in that moment, before she knew his name, before she understood why the entire hidden place had been waiting for her voice, she felt it with absolute certainty. This was not the end of a locked door. This was the beginning of a truth that had been patient long enough to find her.